Hello, hello, and welcome, civics students. It's Mrs. SJ here, Tuesday, October 27th. I am starting right on time at 1 o'clock, and usually we have our civics lesson at 1:10. So I don't see anybody here yet, but I am going to assume that you are trickling in. And when you do get here, I am so happy that you have arrived. You are going to need something to take notes on today. So preferably your notebook where all of your notes from core have been taken on previously. The exit ticket is going to be really the notes that you're going to be taking today, partnered with you reading the NewsELA article that was posted. So shout out to Juna and Jack, who about 10 minutes ago I had seen had read the voting in the U.S. assigned NewsELA article. So we talked about that this morning during our morning meeting. If you have not read it yet, then this lesson will be your first read. You are still expected to read the article, and I will be able to tell if you've read it because NewsELA lets me know when you've read it, and it also lets me know if you've taken the quiz that's part of it as well. So with that, just know that your body right here, you might have your notebook ready to take notes with. You can title your page Core Civics and then make sure to have your date for today. So take a moment to get your notes set up. Now, there are going to be times where we're going to be pausing in today's lesson, and I do have a very robust lesson planned for us. The questions that I will be asking, I'm not going to have you write down every single question. If you can, write down or even share with your parents. That is going to be really the best way to process the information. So if you have a good academic buddy nearby you, an accountability buddy, if your parents are close by, if you don't have anybody, you can just have these conversations with yourself, right? We are our most entertaining friends because we always have each other. Where ourself is always with ourself. I know that sounds kind of funny. So we are going to move on. Let's move on by introducing our focus questions. Now, in our core lesson from yesterday, from Friday, we talked a lot about or I shared this term, voter suppression. And we've been doing a lot of learning about the voting process. How do people vote? Right? We talked about people vote by submitting a ballot or an absentee ballot. Is voting harder than just checking a box? Yes, it is so much harder than that. Today we're going to look at voting throughout history, but more specifically, how many people are actually voting today? So we've really taken this larger look at voting rights since the beginning of the United States. Now, today, we are going to see who has the right to vote and why is voting actually much harder than just checking a box. And then what does voting suppression mean? And how does voter suppression fit into this conversation about checking a box when we vote, right? We would think that based off of our amendments and our history and laws that have been introduced and put in place, that anyone who wanted to vote should be able to vote. So with that, let's move forward. Today, our purpose for reading is this question, right? Why is voting harder than checking a box or just submitting a ballot? So this is a framing before you read this article, or before you read this article, we're thinking about, well, what is voting in the U.S. like today in our modern day, 2020, coming up, T-minus 1 week. Guys, This time next week, things are going to be a little wild, right? We're going to have our election, the news is going to be on, but really, voting's already started. So now I want us to consider, well, what is this? What is the purpose for voting? Well, let's go over some vocabulary. When we say vote, well, there's many different ways of understanding what voting means. Well, we have vote, which is used as a noun, right? So some states make it easier to vote by allowing registration and voting on the same day that you actually vote, right? Your vote is what where you stand on a political idea or a policy or a law that you are either voting yes for or voting no and voting against. Another example of the way that we understand vote is for the vote to be counted, they must take additional steps after election day. Some places you have to bring an ID to the election office. Other places don't require IDs. When we think of a vote in terms of a verb, right? Voting is something that you do, right? So, for example, we've talked about voting as a constitutional amendment that said, actually, we need to fix the original Constitution because it didn't let people who were not land-owning white adult males vote. So we had constitutional amendments that guaranteed voting rights for Black people, for Native Americans, for Asian Americans, for women, and so many other groups of people. And since 2010, this is interesting. Over exactly 25 states have passed stricter voting laws. So that means that if you want to vote, there are more restrictions than permissions, I would say, to be able to vote. And we also know that the person who is voting or putting all of their beliefs and how they want to vote on their actual vote or ballot, you're a voter, right? So some places a registered voter could actually, like, say, testify in court and say this person's a really, like, has great character and has done all of these things. Now, this is also really interesting because, we talked about 25 states have passed stricter laws. In 7 of those states that have the most strict laws, a voter actually has to present their official ID and sometimes paying poll taxes or doing a few other things. We know that further in history, not as much, not today, people had to take literacy tests. There were grandfather clauses that said if your grandfather wasn't a free slave, then you couldn't vote, right? As of today, those things are no longer constitutional or legal. Now, we are going to move forward, and I want you to consider real quick before we begin further, ask your parents, ask a grandparent, ask an aunt or an uncle about a time where maybe they themselves or maybe a person that they knew either decided not to vote or found that voting was hard. Ask them to share that experience with you. This is how history is passed down. We write down history, we pass down history orally, but really, considering people's experiences of when they vote. So now we want to look through this, the text that we put up in NewsELA. Now you might find that this text that's up here, on your screen, might be a little bit more wordy than what is going to be on your NewsELA article. That being said, we're going to read this out loud, and I want you to follow along with me. So elections are what make democracy work. We know democracy is a political idea that believes that every person should have a vote and that the majority of people really hold the power. Voting in the United States, though, can be difficult. Our nation's founders restricted the vote to those who held property or paid taxes. And that meant that white men at that time, right? We talked about this. And since then, constitutional amendments have guaranteed voting rights for really any person of color, women, and African Americans. However, knowing that all these constitutional amendments have passed, many Americans do not vote because circumstances make it difficult. So, for example, most felons can't vote. And most people, I would argue like the majority of people, have to work on election day. To go over quickly, a felon is someone who was convicted and charged of a crime that is constituted as a felony, which is a pretty big crime to commit. And that means that if you were ever committed of a crime that was a felony, that you no longer get the right to vote. Additionally, people without proper identification, right, without a proper ID, might not have their vote counted. Some people want to allow voting by mail all the time, but this is a controversial idea even right now during a pandemic, right? So most states have issued ballots to everybody, but this is still a pretty controversial issue at this point in time. And so consider how, or, you know, think about yourself. What makes voting hard for the voters in your family? Does your family only live here in California? Do you have family that lives on the East Coast? Maybe you have family that lives in the South. I remember Genevieve was saying she went to go visit family in Louisiana. And so I'm wondering, is there anything that made voting hard, or did your family have any experiences that made it more difficult for them to vote? So moving forward, we are really thinking, well, in actuality, how many Americans vote? Well, in 2016, which was our last election, there were, you ready for some math? 245.5 million voting age Americans. Of that whole voting age Americans, 136.8 million voted in the presidential election. So you can do some quick math to see like how many millions of people didn't vote, right? That figure represented, let's go back. That figure represented 56% of voters, according to this research center called the Pew Research Center, which is the organization that collects data and information. You know, we've done a lot of data analysis in our work in 4th and 5th grade. And among wealthy nations, the United States, and you know, when we talk about among wealthy nations in the world, the United States ranks near the bottom in voter turnout, which means that about 1/3 of American adults are not registered to vote, which means they don't vote. And consider, you know, before we move on to number 2, what can you do to help people get out and vote? How can we perhaps inspire people to go out and vote? And let me quickly move myself so that I'm not blocking that question here. Okay. Now for the second part, I want us to consider, well, why don't more Americans vote? So we know that only half of all Americans vote. So let's continue. So why don't more Americans vote? If you have any ideas before we go forward, go ahead and type in the chat. Why don't more Americans vote? I can see there are 14 of you here. Declan, I'm glad that you said hello. Hello, Declan. I'm glad that you are here and watching. But go ahead and write down in the chat, what are some ideas we have of why Americans don't vote? Now remember, we said about 1/3 of Americans aren't registered to vote. So I'm wondering if the registration process is difficult. Oh goodness, skipping forward. I gotta go back a bit. So for number 2, why don't Americans vote? Well, there are many reasons, right? And I'm going to keep my eye on this chat because I want to see if any of us have an idea of why. Well, 1 in 4 registered voters didn't vote in 2016 because they didn't like the candidates or campaign issues. So remember, back in 2016, we had a big election. You know, it was the end of President Obama's term, and we know that presidents can only serve for 2 4-year terms. So that means that a Republican candidate can run to vote and a Democrat candidate can run to vote. And so we have something called primary. So there were a lot of people who wanted to run for president in 2016 who were either Democrat or Republican. And we have our primary election, primary meaning first, because we first have to figure out, well, who are our front runners? And, you know, with Donald Trump became the front runner for the Republican Party. It was very close between John Kasich and, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting her name. Well, Marianne, I'm not representing my memory very well here, but we had a handful of frontrunners. But as we know, Donald Trump was the frontrunner for the Republican Party. For the Democrat Party, we had Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders. And then in the end, for the primaries, it was also very controversial, but we ended up moving forward with Hillary Clinton. And as we know, in 2016, Hillary Clinton lost. And so most people are saying, well, they actually didn't vote because they didn't like the candidate. Oh, I want to read something that Dermot wrote. Dermot said most Americans aren't voting because of a lot of reasons, only a few of them valid. But one of them is that either they're embarrassing people about for making rude remarks about who they voted for. So there naturally is going to be a feeling of judgment of like, I don't want to tell people I voted for this person because I'm worried they're going to judge me for it. But feeling pressure of how people are going to think of you versus like voting for a candidate who has campaign issues that you also care about is very important, right? And so we talk a lot about, well, what is an actual reason of why people don't vote? And some of us can say, well, there's no good reason for people not to vote, but people are not voting. So we need to like really think, well, why? So let's continue. Others didn't think that their vote would make a difference. They think, well, I'm just one person. Some said they were too busy because in America, we do not have our election day is not a holiday. It's not a national holiday, which means that people have to work. Certain states make it possible to register and vote on the same day. They also might offer early voting and voting by mail. Other states, well, they make it more difficult. So it really, this is another larger thing. It's generally believed that when more people vote, it helps Democrats because more people of color and low-income voters participate, which means that people of color and low-income voters tend to have values that align with the Democrat political party, right? Oftentimes, especially the bigger issues that you're finding with the Democratic Party is healthcare, climate change, getting rid of student debt, helping with additional social problems, right? And once we have social programs that help people who might be low income, who might need additional support, who might have pre-existing healthcare conditions, will tend to vote for issues that they care about. And so think, is that a logical way to think, well, if we let more people vote, that means more people are going to vote Democrat? So this is another interesting question to ask. Should it matter whether or not a voter likes the candidate? Should they still vote? Should it matter whether or not the voter likes the candidate? Should they still vote? This is really a big question. We're not looking for, I'm not going to be giving any answers right now. I have my opinion. But what's important is to consider, as citizens, do we have an obligation to vote whether or not we like the candidates? So, how do states limit voting? Okay. We are going to continue looking at 3 and 4. All right. And I am going to try and move a little quicker because it is 1:21 and I want to finish and give you about 5 minutes in between. So we're going to continue for about 4 more minutes. If you are coming in late, you have your notebook with a writing utensil. The exit ticket is going to be taking notes and reading this article on NewsELA and answering the quiz that is a part of this. Okay? And once you finish those 2 things, I will be notified on NewsELA, but you will also go back to Google Classroom and just press mark as done or submit. Okay? Now, let's continue reading. We have 3 and 4 to cover. In some states, old laws made it really hard for Black people to vote. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 outlawed this. If you're going to take notes on something, this might be like, what is the Voting Rights Act of 1965? We talked a little bit about this, and I bet you've learned about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in a few of your other classes as well. And this is something we can continue to learn about. However, some lawmakers still try to make voting tough. In general, Republicans want state laws requiring voters to show official IDs. Republicans will usually say that this will stop election fraud. Democrats say voter fraud rarely happens. They say Republicans just want to reduce the number of Democrat voters. Well, you guys, this was very interesting because, it's not just a they said, right? Here, I want to point out, and especially in this article where it says Republicans say that there's election fraud and Democrats say there isn't. Well, where's the evidence, right? Well, there have been research organizations that have found that in all of the elections throughout our country's time, there have only been 0.3, out of all the votes, 0.3%, 0.3, not even a whole percentage. There has only been 0.3% of votes that were fraudulent, which means that either there were duplicates, someone maybe voted on behalf of someone who might have passed away. But when we look at the evidence, there has been zero evidence of election fraud, or pointing to the fact that it's happening often enough to make voting voters have a lot of restrictions, right? Also, some states end up removing voters from registration lists if they haven't voted in a handful of years. Okay. So those are a few ways that states limit voting. They limit voting by asking us to show IDs, something else that's not quite in this that I would also add, and we can look at some more articles about this, is that Republicans have, and I'm realizing I'm blocking number 4 with my video. Let me move myself over here a bit. Ta-da! Here we go. Hope that's better. This is really important to consider because states are also limiting voting by getting rid of voting polls. And not just voting polls, they are also removing the vote where you put your ballot. So if you're doing your ballot at home as an absentee ballot, and to put it in a approved polling box with where your ballot goes, they're getting rid of those. So what I'll do is I will look and get some actual articles, because if I'm making a claim, I need to back it up with evidence, right? So really, there is a lot more ways that states are limiting voting by requiring IDs, by removing people from lists, by removing polling places, making it harder to vote, by having long lines, right? So already people have started noticing that some folks are having to stand in line for upwards of 4 hours. I think I was hearing in some states there was someone who stood in line for 8 hours in order to cast their vote. Okay. Now it is 1:26. We are going to pause right here because there's a lot of information. So this gives you some time. If you have not finished reading, you will get to read this, and we are going to continue to go over this together. Please take some time to read through this entire article, because things that are worthy and are really important often take a few times of reading and trying and discussing for us to really understand what we're talking about, especially something as complicated as voting in the United States. So with that, we're going to end at how do states limit voting. We're going to pick up on number 4 when we continue this lesson on Friday. So I hope you have a great makerspace. I will see some of my kiddos for writing. If you're in writing group A, I will see you after makerspace. Okay.